who was it, that said, no man is free till all men are free?
Yeah.
I sort of adopted that as my philosophy.
You don't run into a competent free spirit like him often. I mean, all of us have weaknesses, but he compensates on that and his ability to have significant empathy. And I think people feel that.
That he's a caring, loving person. That's, to me, the most.
Good person, good human being.
And he knew your story. He knew what you were struggling with. He knew what was going on with your kids. He knew what was going on in your relationship. He knew how broke you were. John knew all that stuff. He asked and he paid attention. So I guess that's it. He just really paid attention, from a very early age, in a very, with a lot of humanity.
They say that there's nothing unique under the sun. I don't know how they would make another one of him. That's what I would say. These, not into my adjectives, but you can see from these stories, perhaps, will tell the truth.
My father was in the Navy. My mother worked as a waitress. And I was born, I think, on East 57th Street. I think there was St. Elizabeth Hospital. And my father was discharged from the Navy. And so they moved into my mother's great aunt's house, Aunt Mamie, that was at 63 Cherry Street in Somerville.
This is the house I grew up in, right here. That's the first I remember. And my brother Douglas, he was born here. My brother Danny was. And we lived here with my mother. My father wasn't around that much. I remember my mother complaining about my father. He said he's the only man I knew who wouldn't buy coal for his kids.
Dougie was born shortly after we came back from New York at the Chelsea Naval Hospital. And then Danny was born actually at St. Elizabeth's in Brighton over there.
Because we didn't have any money and my father was gone, my mother's brother, Francis Quirk, bought the house and we had to move. So we started moving. And that was the end of 63 Cherry Street for us. This is when I was growing up. I went to church here on Sundays. I got christened here and I received my confirmation here. I lived like 2.5 blocks down the street on Cherry Street. And Dougie, my brother Dougie and my brother Danny, we all went to church here.
Well, I mean, my mother was a glue that held us together, And so she was, it was very important to her to keep all the kids with her and together. Of course, it was sometimes difficult when there was no place to go.
So how did your mother manage?
To this day, I have no idea.
She was one of the most interesting people I've ever met. She was a lovely lady.
We had occasion to go to Hudson, which I mean, I'm from Detroit, so I was learning Boston, and suddenly here John is from, first they say he's from Somerville, but then he say, well, he went from Somerville to Hudson, and I have no reference points for Hudson. So John decides to take Greg and I to meet his mom.
And she's a wonderful hostess. And then I can remember John's trying to get us some grub together in the kitchen, and she's in there, and she tries to go in there. And I still quote, this drives John crazy, but she's yelling, Johnny, get out of the kitchen. There ain't room enough in there for two of us. And then she said, don't mind us, Clifford. We're always hollering at each other. Doesn't mean a thing.
The thing I want to convey, you know, they talk about tiger mothers. Well, there is something like a working class tiger mother. I had one, he had one, but these were women who didn't have necessarily resources, but they had to be the mother, the father, the breadwinner, the disciplinarian, the everything. And the point I would most make is that from meeting his mother, I feel I have a unique understanding of him, because I met the person from whom he got his values and his understanding of love and the family and community, and it wasn't necessarily done in the sort of middle class way, but it nevertheless produced a group of sons, all of whom are reflective of better values, and that didn't just fall out the sky, it came from someone. And I'm going to attribute it to her.
When I was 8 and Douglas was 7, I don't recall my father living with us, but he seemed to be working for the railroad at the time. He was working on one of those little houses that switch the tracks as the train goes by. And he wanted to send us out to Chicago to see his mother and father. He also had a brother who was married out there. And another brother, Jack, who was married to Betty, who split his time between Dallas and Chicago. So we didn't get on the train in South Station, which we normally did. I believe we got on someplace around Springfield because he knew the conductor, and they just put us on the train, the two of us.
It was quite an experience being on a train like that with the, the dining car and the cereal and everything. And the waiter in the dining car wanted to put cream on the cereal, and we were really reluctant to do that because whoever had cream on their cereal before, they didn't trust this stuff.
We visited my grandmother, my grandfather, who had lost a leg in the railroad, who also worked in the railroad for years. He had a peg leg, I remember that. And then we drove with my uncle and aunt to Dallas.
What she remembers on that trip is me looking out the window and saying, look, there's a cowboy, it's a cowboy. And she thought that was the funniest thing in the world because it was an old black guy on a donkey.
I don't know exactly why we went to Dallas, but I remember they were really upset that we didn't know how to eat properly. We didn't know what a salad fork was, a plates, a tablecloth, because we had never been to a restaurant before. And then they drove us back to Chicago, and we ended up taking the train back to Boston.
John and I have been through so many of these things together that it's almost difficult to separate the two. I mean, this thought just came to mind that when we went to summer camp through the Boys Club or Catholic Charities or somebody, they used to give us this awful pea soup. But John liked the peas and I liked the soup. So he had the peas and I had the soup. And, that's how we got through. Maybe that's still how we get through. I don't know.
I want to say it's 51. We moved into the projects. It was nice, there was 3 bedrooms and, there was all new appliances and everything. So we all loved it, And then there was a lot of kids there also in the projects. And there was a school, the Haley School that's still there right up the street from in Winter Hill.
I know when I went to school, the teacher said, oh my God, your father deserted you and went to New York. I said, no, my father's in Scully Square. He's drinking and gambling. Your father's in Scully.
And my father was not around much, but anyways, the twins were born there, my twin brothers. My mother was 48. We always call my mother Irene, but her real name is Mary Irene Quirk was her maiden name. And she grew up in Watertown. She had one sister, Eleanor, and two brothers, one James Francis and the other Douglas Quirk.
Some things that, one story with John that really struck me is like when, there were 4 boys and the mother had twins. His mother had twins at 48, and she would get an apartment, but there were always too many of them. So then they would have the person who would come and check up on them, and so John would leave the house and have a stroller with two of his two brothers and push him, and he was like 8 or 9, and he said he would push by and then he could see the social worker walking by, and he said it just struck him that, don't you think that's a little odd, in your own neighborhood, to see a 8 or 9-year-old boy pushing twins. And he said it just taught him to be really aware of like what's happening around you, with your community and what's happening to people near you. And I think he just had a real awareness of that really young kind of thing.
I mean, I remember walking down the street and seeing the social worker and thinking, I'm going to be a social worker when I grow up, but the right guy who knows who the family is, and stuff.
They were one of the first family, I think, evicted from the public housing in Somerville. And there's a picture of them, the mother and the 5 boys, on the train tracks with their shopping bags going out to the poor farm, getting the train out to Hudson.
Well, after my mother and my aunt Eleanor bumped into an old friend at a wake, her husband had bought the Old Town Poor Farm that was right here. And there was a barn attached, which was right over there. And she said, what are you doing with all these kids in the city? There was 5 kids, and my mother and our family, our father was gone, and the Collinses, my cousins, had 7 kids. So we took the train from Porter Square that stopped right there with our shopping bags. We didn't have any suitcases, no furniture, and we moved up here.
What I remember about it is how frightening it was. It was frightening because it was so dark. It was the country. There was nothing around there, and it was very difficult to relate to that environment. And we lived in a house that was, the barn was there, but there wasn't anything else around there. And so it took a long time to adapt to that, I think.
Jack Rabbit used to go down the main street. It was all farms.
This is 30 Pope Street in Hudson. That's the house I moved to from 544 Main Street, which was the Old Town Poor Farm. We moved here because we didn't pay the rent on Main Street, and this was in town. We never had a car, so it was also closer to stuff that we could walk to the high school, and the kids, my brothers, could walk to the grammar school and walk to church. I used to go to church here every Sunday up until I graduated from high school when I was 17. In addition, I took my twin brothers, who were 8 years younger than me, to church here. There's a path right over there. Pope Street, where we lived, is 2 blocks over. Would walk across this path and into the church, and I made sure I brought them all the time.
What was still impressive in my mind to this day, which is, probably 55 years ago now, right? That his attention to detail of the Mass, with the Rosary, and including us in it.
There was a joke that we had the only slum in Hudson. And but Chuck always says that there was, you talk about these welfare people not fixing stuff, there was a broken window in the room, my bedroom, and it just never got fixed, you know what I mean? And Chuck says to me one time, I know why you like the cold, because you had that broken window. It never got fixed.
Those were good times going up into that house to visit them.
This one morning, it was terribly snowy and cold and dark, and it was miserable. But John and his friend were having a good time with each other, and they said that I should, run toward them and slide like in a hockey move, and they would just check me like this would be fun. I'd land in the snow. So, the reason it bears repeating because I still have the memory of running and them, of course, flipping me up in the air, and the snow wasn't that thick, and of course I landed directly on my back. And they had a very good laugh at my expense. So that taught me to be a little bit careful of John's practical jokes.
Whatever he was, if he was the guidance counselor, I know he was the hockey coach. He was a great big guy, like 6'6", 6'8", and he had a deep voice, and I told him, I want to take the college course. He said, you can't take the fucking college course. I said, why? He said, you're on welfare. You got to go to work and help your mother. I'm not letting you take the college course. I'm like, okay, And so I took the business course.
This is where I lived, and John rarely got down my way. I was always going up that way. That's the town line there for Hudson, Gleasondale, Stowe. And the one time I remember him coming down here, he comes in the house and he says, you want to go to San Francisco? I said, okay. And he said, but first we have to stop in Florida on the way to San Francisco so we can get a job and get some money to get out there to San Francisco. John always makes things interesting and fun. Every time.
The first night we got put in protective custody because we were broke in Fort Lauderdale. They locked us up. And then the police got us a job at the Pinecrest Lakes Club, which is in the middle of Florida. And we were busboys there. And they wouldn't let blacks in the dining room, to work even. I thought that was really odd. And the blacks were caddies. And so we used to go, Tom and I used to go drink with the caddies.
Yeah.
And then there was 2 Cubans, one older guy, me and Tom, worked in the dining room. And the 2 Cubans, they decided we should go on strike. We weren't getting enough pay. And so, of course,
The beginning of your union career, John.
I become the leader, of course, of the organizing committee of 5. And Tom and I got fired in the middle, and they told us to get off the ground, but it was in the middle of nowhere. It was really funny because we stole the golf cart.
Drove it out.
They were looking for us, right? They were coming after us. I won this car in a card game down at the Hollywood Beach Hotel. And Dougie and I tried to organize the bus boys at the Hollywood Beach Hotel. And we got fired.
John got fired, and then I quit, and we took off and drove around the country.
And my mother, she was always rip shit at Douglas and I for not staying home and providing for her and the kids, But I think we realized early on that if we didn't leave, we'd be stuck there, you know?
We drove over to Dallas to visit my aunt. Then we drove up to Logan, Utah to visit my cousin. And then we came back home again. And by that time, we knew that the draft was there.
Well, I knew about Vietnam, but you know, my knowledge of Vietnam was based on the television and newspaper articles, you know, and I knew from my skill set, the business course, etc., and not going to college, that I was going to wind up in the infantry. So instead of being drafted into the Army, I joined the Marine Corps because I thought that they were the tough guys and that they knew more about fighting than the Army did. And I mean, I guess I really sort of dreamed that up. I mean, I really didn't like discuss it with anyone.
We both got drafted, meaning not only did we get called up to get classified, but we got the notices that said, you know, greetings, you are hereby instructed to report. And again, the differences between John and me, is that I went in the Air Force and John went into the Marines. So, you know, we had very different goals and very different outlooks at that point.
I mean, I really believed that we were trying to defeat communism, you know, because that was what I heard on the television, the newspapers.
Right.
So I was going to go help, because communism was bad, I thought, at the time. I was going to go help defeat the commies.
Right.
You know? So everybody at Camp Pendleton, who I was with, there was thousands. I mean,
yeah,
were on their way to Vietnam. Took a ship, and took like 28 days.
Yeah.
It must have been like 3,000 or 5,000 guys on there. We went back to Dong Ha, which wasn't too far from Con Thien, and we regrouped and repacked and picked up everyone. We marched from there, probably 10 miles, I think, up to the Ben Hai River. And that morning, when I got up, first of all, we said, the other Marines, that they were bringing these trucks in, you know, across the river, like the Ben Hai River. And they were telling us they don't have trucks, right? We said they do have trucks. And when I woke up in the morning, which was July 29th, I was looking into North Vietnam. I mean, I was looking across, and it was right there. I said, what the fuck am I doing here? I said, I shouldn't be here. We're out on the road in the jungle. And Frenchie, this guy from upstate New York, was walking point. He was a short, dark-complected young man. I wasn't sure of his nationality or last name. And I knew he was Frenchie because he had it written on his helmet. One side of the dirt road was thick with vegetation. And to the right was deserted French rice paddies off to the other side. It was very tense and quiet until all of a sudden a burst of M16 fire roared out of Frenchie's gun. Everyone got down, and then everyone got up. We saw an old woman, a younger woman, her husband, and a young girl crying and screaming. Beneath them lay a young boy, shot and bleeding to death, dying right there in front of us. His little brown body was lifeless below me. There was blood all over the place. The mother and grandmother and the little girl were all covered with blood. The people were screaming and hollering and crying. Our lieutenant and captain
went and tried to talk to them. However, of course, none of them spoke Vietnamese, and they did not speak English. Finally, our captain ordered one of us to give them a poncho. We gave the mother a green rubber poncho. She unfolded it, spread it out on the little dirt road, sobbing, crying, screaming, and talking fast in Vietnamese. She gently picked up the boy, wrapped him carefully in the poncho. I remember watching the blood spread out and stain the green poncho. The officers gave the people American money and a couple of boxes of sea rations. The people started to walk away with that little boy wrapped in the poncho, carrying the sea rations, continuing to sob and cry. The first squad was put in front of the tank, walking point for the entire battalion. I was in the second squad with Frenchie. Frenchie was directly behind the tank, followed by a radio man, the lieutenant, and then me. All of a sudden, a blast blew me off my feet, and we were sprayed with machine gun fire. The entire area was sprayed with bullets. I could not see who was firing at us. Everyone was down, and I heard people yelling, "Frenchie's been hit, Frenchie's been hit." When I looked up, there was no Frenchie, just pieces of flesh and body parts. An arm here, a leg there, and all this firing going on. It was then that I realized that the NBA had attempted to blow up the tank. They just missed and blown Frenchie apart. Lieutenant was yelling that everyone help fletch Frenchie's body parts. We took a poncho, unfolded it, laid it on the ground, and proceeded to pick up whatever parts we could find. There was an arm here, a leg there, and different parts of flesh covered with dirt and blood. I remember picking up parts of his skull by the hair with his brains hanging out and putting it all in the poncho. We found his dog tags and put them in the poncho too. The blood spread out and stained the green poncho. I thought of that little boy being carried off in the poncho and now Frenchie in the poncho. I often wondered if it was payback for shooting the boy or Frenchie was just hit by chance. The day I got out of the military, I joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I mean, I was quite well aware of it, the past 5 months that I was home. I mean, I was reading everything.
Yeah.
And I was, watching the stories about the resistance. Someone told me about UMass Boston, and so I went there, and they said, "We're not going to let you in." And then someone said, "Oh, by the way, this is a special admissions program, They let people in who have potential." At the time, there was a woman named Chancey Crawford, whose father was a business agent for the United Mine Workers.
Oh.
She was from West Virginia, and she was tough, but she was good, And so she said, I was really frustrated. She said, "Well, what are you going to do if I don't let you in?" I said, "I'm going to burn the school down." And she said, "Well, don't do that. We'll let you in." And so that's where I started. What happened is I was so humiliated by the experience, I just said to myself, well, I'm going to help other people get in, so they don't have to do what I did.
Some people that get to college that didn't expect to go to college really appreciate it. But I think that John took that the next step up and thought that if he could go or if I could go, and we weren't in that college group at that time at our age, that we were going to college, it wasn't an automatic. He thought that, well, if we could do it, other people could do it.
There was a lot of veterans around that didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
I mean,
didn't know what they were going to do, and they didn't know about the benefits. You know, they didn't know you could go to UMass for nothing.
I was placed in a halfway house as a volunteer working with hardcore male offenders. And Shorty Baker, who is called Shorty because he's about 5'3", if that, Afro-American, unbeknownst to me when I first met him, was a former resident of the halfway house. He apparently, I learned later, had served time in just about every federal penitentiary in the country. And he and I became really, really good friends. And we were walking by UMass Boston at one point and walked by my brother's place, and John was there. And I was talking to John, and Shorty had expressed to me a desire to go to college. And John had been actively helping people get into UMass Boston. And so I introduced them, and the three of us became very good friends.
So I'm out on the street talking to people and waving my hand. I look up, and who's coming down the street but Joe Sosek? And now I know Joe is a counselor at a halfway house around the corner on Clarendon Street, the Brook House. And he's got this black guy with him, who I see, and they're approaching.
Yeah, and when we get near John, keep in mind that I just recently got released from the penitentiary. So with people waving their arms and carrying on, it could be a threat, you know. And so I'm looking at him, and he's just like directing traffic and opening the doors and things. And he's talking. And I says to Joe Sosa, I said, that guy's crazy, you know. Joe says, don't worry about it, he's all right.
John and his friend Chuck Kelly went to New Orleans one time looking for Shorty Baker. And of course, they were looking in all the bars in the toughest section of town, Dryad Street.
And I said to John, you can't be wrong and around. You gotta be steady with me. John decided that he'll do what he wants. You know, familiar with John, you know, he goes off and does his thing. So I'm looking for him in the bar. I asked all of the guys, hey, you seen that white guy over there? Now he stands out like he's so lovely. Nobody has seen him. Where was John? It's not hard to believe, but John was underneath the car hiding from me. So that leave him alone so he can do what he wants.
Students were just so active in changing many of the structures within the university that is, so we were both involved in a lot of that stuff through those years.
That building right across the street there, right on Berkeley Street, was a UMass building. And I gave my first major speech there, an anti-war speech on September the 15th, 1969. And that was the student movement too, because the blacks spoke, the women spoke, daycare people spoke, lesbians spoke, and that was the kickoff of working together with other students to build a coalition to change the university. In 1970, on May 4th, there was a demonstration at Kent State University, and the National Guard shot a student and killed her. It was on the front page of all the papers across the country. Then a lot of schools went on strike, and we did here too at UMass. And I was the leader of the strike, and this was the registrar's building. We took over the registrar's building, and for 2 weeks we ran the strike out of this building here. There was like 200 of us in there, and we occupied it all night and day for those 2 weeks until there was a settlement with the university about courses and grades.
So, you know, that was really, like, we really demanded black studies, women's studies, daycare.
John had been in Vietnam, and I had been at Harvard, even though we both came from working class backgrounds. I was going to work in a program in Columbia Point, which was a infamous housing project in Boston. You probably remember it, for the summer. And I was going to live there. And John's cousin, Danny Court, who was in the Marines with him and had come over back at the same time, was collecting rents for the Boston Housing Authority. John asked Danny where he might obtain a good summer job, and Danny said with these Harvard guys who were going to live in the housing project for the summer. And so we trained together.
What I really did was started this, because I was in very good shape, and I just got back from Vietnam. I started this backpacking stuff,
Oh.
where I take these kids, 2 days, then the next week 3 days, then 4 days, but they loved this, right? But we'd make them, first of all, we'd make them read and write, so they couldn't go on the trip unless they read a story and wrote about it. That was the criteria,
Uh-huh.
So we're very strict about that. So they couldn't go. So they would all read and write because they really loved me because this was like, they talk about it today.
He'd take the 12-year-olds all over the place with pup tents and a backpack and an axe and a shovel and go into the woods and drive someplace and set up camp, real camp.
And then they used to say, when you get back to the projects, my uncle's going to get you. Did this to us. My cousin's going to get you. I say, good.
The programming that he was able to give the kids was able to compete with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They'd rather be with John.
I met Doug Clifford and John Clifford at my brother's place, the bar room in Park Square. We all went to UMass Boston, these old dilapidated buildings, and all of us worked two jobs. Doug was the bartender,
A waiter,
right?
And he made sandwiches, ham and provolone.
The way I met Doug and John was that I used to drive cabs, and sometimes I would work late, right? So I'd come in a little bit messed up in the morning. I'd go to where the Flashes next door.
Yeah.
You couldn't drink that coffee; it was poison, right? And I'd take the coffee, I'd spill it half out, I'd go into the bar room and fill it up with anisette.
John was working at my brother's place, and that was sort of a hotbed of various activities, you might say. And I have a friend. I still have a friend. He's teaching acting in Manhattan now. His name is Stuart Burney. But Stuart had an incident in the hotel. He was a hotel manager. We were friendly. He got fired from the hotel, and he was acting, and he wanted to drive a cab to support his acting. And he failed the test because he was from New York, and he didn't know the streets. And the test at the time was centered around the streets. So John was explaining this, Stuart was explaining this to John, and John signaled a guy over who was a Boston police, a police lieutenant or something from the Hackney division, and said, "Oh, why didn't you tell me?" And Phil and said, "Stuart, here, show up here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Stuart showed up and he gave him his license.
Boston Globe did an expose on sports bookmaking.
Yeah.
And it was a 4-part series, but one of them was, the name of it was My Brother's Place. A place where police officers, postal workers, construction workers, and UMass students come together to drink, have sandwiches, and place bets.
I remember John getting in the Salata Tea building, getting people together, because he figured out he knew this vault was running Boston, he knew who was running the war, and he knew where they were, and he knew how we could go and get them.
He wasn't as clear as that when he was drunk at my
I mean, he wasn't drunk, though.
No.
He had a broomstick, and he had a broomstick up in the Salata Tea building, and a chalkboard. And he would point out everything, this connected with this one's on the Harvard board, this one's from there, and this is what's going on, to teach everybody how this all held together. In the Salata Tea building with his broomstick. And I'll always remember.
To be with John, you had to be able to multitask. I mean, honestly, is that you could never go any place. I mean, for 50 years I've known this guy, right? He always knew more people. He always knew everything that was going on. You could never question anything he ever did. So if you wanted to be a friend of his, you either got drunk before he did or just didn't pay attention to him. But he knew, ever you go someplace, there'd be a line of people saying, hi John, how you doing? We came back one time to the bar room, right, and he says, do you know what I just did? I was with a bunch of students protesting the war. And he says, on the other side of the protest were all our friends from the bar. Zeke, the construction guy, the post office guys, right? I said, what happened, John? He says, they smiled at me and I smiled at them and said, we'll see you at the bar later, right?
God, the first time I met him was when he came into the union office where I was working with my cousin Anne Marie. And he was friends with Joe Quirk, who worked there at the time, was Anne Marie's boyfriend. And he had just come back from Ireland, and he had this long letter that he wrote about his time in Ireland. So Joe wasn't there, so he left the letter with Anne Marie to give to Joe. So he just came in, he said hello, and then he left, and we saw him, Anne Marie said, okay. We saw the elevator door closed, and she got out the letter, and we read it page by page. She read the verse, and then I read it, and then, on and on. And then eventually he came to work there. So that's where I met him at 8 Beacon Street, 14 Beacon Street, and at the union office. I was curious to learn more about him. Yeah, I was. I was very curious after I read that letter.
And 10 was the professionals in education, people who might have taught at the prisons or might have taught at the mental health hospitals or worked for the Department of Education of Massachusetts. And they had let that Unit 10 go because they didn't think they could win it. And they were taking polls, so they decided that they were going to win everything. So they said, well, we might as well go after Unit 10. Joe Quirk, who was Paul Quirk's brother, I worked with him when I got out of Vietnam down the steak pub in Dennisport. So he knew me. So he called me and said, could I go to work like tomorrow in organizing this Unit 10? So I did. And it turned out we won Unit 10, right? So I got credit for that. And then they kept me on as a staff person to service Unit 10.
So, he was, in that job, he was more of a very professional person. And I could see, first of all, my first view of him was on paper. He was a good writer. And he was always good at the paper, at the actual writing of reports and writing things up. And I know he has that other side, but he was very good in the professional vein of organizing and representing workers also.
Some of us decided that Pat should run. So she ran, and she lost. And Paul fired both of us. He fired both of us. And he was screaming at me, you ruined everything, you ruined everything. I went to work for 1199 Hospital Workers Union. And this bitter struggle developed within 1199, which was between the CP, which was really all male, Jewish, and the blacks. And they had hired me to be area director of Massachusetts. There was some corruption here, to clean that up, which I did. And then I was running the union, but this bitter fight was going on. And I hired Jolie, who was Afro-American, and they didn't like him. They didn't like me either. we won this big election, for, which was Unit 7 of the nurses, the state of Massachusetts, which was 3,700 people, which is a big deal. And they fired me the next day.
September 4th, 1983.
1983.
We used to go to Block Island, and we went with Ken Reeves and Greg Johnson. And Ken's like pageantry and spaz. So he was telling me what I had to do for the wedding, and I said, well, I'm not really going to do anything. So if you want to do it, you can do it. And so him and Pat ran the wedding, and
Now, Pat claimed to me the other day that she just wanted to have a little wedding. And the next thing she knew, there were 30,000 people coming.
Well, I think she did, but if I was going to get married, I wanted everyone there. Ken said, you can't have just the best man. You have to have ushers, you know. And I had a lot of friends, you know, so he said, but they have to be tall and thin, right? So I said, well, here's a list. You pick the ushers. You know, and David was like, am I too fat? That's why. And Shorty said, you know, he didn't want any black people, you know. You know, Ken's black.
It was a weekend wedding. We had an outside barbecue at Danny and Ellie's house. Friday night, I think we had the rehearsal dinner, and then it was a whole Labor Day weekend. It was a fun weekend.
John wasn't too much of a religious guy. Pat got him to go in and do the church thing, and it was a funny time. And he had the song being sung, "Change Is Gonna Come" by Sam Cooke. That was his favorite song, and that was his song at the wedding. And he had the peanut guy, Little Joe Cook, was this old black singer from the 50s, in the Cantab Lounge, sing some of the songs at the ceremonies before. I think he was trying to drive Pat's parents crazy, but they came to love him vividly.
Greg says to me that men marry their mothers, and I think it's true. I think Pat has all the no-nonsense and not put up with that his mother had, although hers is in a much more angelic wrapping.
Well, you know, I mean, you got to believe that John got the better part of that bargain. I mean, you just have to believe that. But I think that was the prevailing opinion, is that this would be very good for John, and good luck to Pat. You know?
First of all, the two of them are like a love story. I mean, they are really a couple that love each other.
Something that I think is really frequently missed about my father is how overwhelmingly loving and caring and protective, in the cutest way possible, that he is of her. So he would always buy her flowers and gifts.
I had, it's very hard to believe, but I had a reputation for being too tough, you know?
In the unions?
Yeah. Well, there was a strike in Amherst, the Amherst nursing home, and this guy, his name was Sanders, he organized all the labor people at the UMass Labor School to come on the picket line. Like 250, 300 showed up, and he organized these sit-down strikes in the driveway, you know. And the police were arresting people, and they're hitting people. And then he got arrested right away because they knew him. So I was kind of the leader. I was the leader. So I was being careful not to get arrested because I was the only one there from the union, you know. And then at the end of the day, this cop, they had this kid, the cop hit the kid with a billy club, you know, and broke his nose open. So I said, you think you're a tough guy? And he was going to hit me with the club, and I blocked it, and I hit him. I hit him several times because the police were I was pummeling him. I broke his jaw. Yeah, so I'm a convicted felon or something. You know, I was really blackballed from the unions after that. So I didn't have, I didn't know what I was going to do, actually. And when Pat and I got fired back in '78 or so, Pat got fired because they really fired me illegally because it was a staff union. So they gave me $20,000 in the end. So this guy said, "You want to buy this bar?" And I said, "Yes." This is '78.
So we're talking about Green Street Grill.
Yeah, so now it's 5 years later, and I go in there to have lunch.
Oh, you mean you didn't do it at that time?
No, the guy wouldn't sell it. I mean, the guy he was the original owner. He had had it since 1930s. And I was broke. I mean, I was like really broke. And the guy says to me, "You still want to buy this place?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, let's negotiate." And I borrowed $1,000 from this one, $2,000 from that one. Anyways, I come up with $10,000, and I got Stephen Oakley to be a partner, and he come up with $10,000. The Jazz Workshop in Paul's Mall is located on Boylston Street, right across from the Prudential Center. And I worked at the Sheraton Boston in 1965 as a bellhop. In '66, that's basically, the Sheraton Boston was attached to the Prudential Center. So I worked 3 to 11, I'd go over there at 11 o'clock to the Jazz Workshop, and everybody was there. I mean, Miles Davis, Coltrane was there, Cannonball Adderley, and a whole host of people. And at the time, you didn't have to pay if you sat at the bar, so I'd go in 11:30 and sit at the bar and listen to the music. And then there was other night spots in Boston at the time. There was a joint on Tremont Street called Conley's. It was kind of like a famous local place, and the musicians used to go up there and jam after gigs, and then there was Wally's, which is still there now, but it used to be on the left-hand side of the street. It was kind of big, and they had jazz in there. And there was a couple other places that name escapes me. When I went to UMass, and I became friends with David Vitale, he had worked in the Institute for Learning and Teaching with Leonard Brown.
Oh.
And Leonard Brown was a saxophone player, is a saxophone player, and written many books in music. Well, he was playing all around these clubs in Boston. And we used to go there and listen to him. All these local guys. So my idea was to start Charlie's, to bring those people in to, which the name was Charlie's Tap at the time, the Green Street Grill.
It was an emanation of his social grace, political grace, humor, collegiality, sense of community.
It was the attitude, atmosphere of the environment that was inclusive, right? Not just for the neighborhood, but for everyone in the city.
I was pregnant with Frank, our son, when we had the opening party, and which was around New Year's. So it was a lot of change for us at the time. Starting the business, starting a family all at once.
Well, what happened is, I didn't really know anything about the food, and Stephen didn't either, and he was supposed to be in charge of the food originally, but I mean, we didn't really know. We didn't know what we were doing.
I think John had a vision. I'm not sure that he knew what it was exactly, but he had some kind of a vision.
We started having music right in the beginning. I mean, I think we opened in, roughly say, October
of '83, and like in January we had music, and actually Leonard Brown. Well, I was friends with him this time from Vitali.
Yeah.
He said to use this guy. This guy's name was Tim Ingalls, and he was in New York. You know, this guy told me, "You want to put this place on the map for jazz?" He said, "Get David Murray." You know, what's his? So, and his say-so, I got David Murray, who I never heard of, and there was lines around the block.
For a number of years, John had what I would consider one of the best jazz venues in the history of Boston and Cambridge.
Well, we used to have people from New York, like on the weekends. Then we'd have local people during the week, you know. We used to have a jam session on Sunday. Monday we had a poetry read. Tuesday we had a magic night. Wednesday was a jazz night. And Thursday, in the beginning, it was an African night, African music, and then it was Latin music. So we kind of had Latin, African. And I mean, I just got to know all these musicians, you know.
The musicians give us as much room as we need to play what we wanted to play. There was no standing behind you about 45-minute sets or things, at least I never got that. So once we started music, if we did a set and it was an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes, that's what it was. Because you let the music determine that.
It was very ambitious, and they were really first-class players doing jazz, contemporary jazz.
His real love for the music and respect for the musicians.
I bought a lot of her stuff and put it up in the Green Street Grill. Early stuff in the '80s, so she loved me for that, and you know, and then she was doing this performance art, you know. So I used to go see her sometimes, and
I was working with musicians. I've done this thing called, I would paint live to music for like over 40 years, so I did a lot of experimental work with that. Maybe John came to one of those things. He saw my drawings, and so all the flyers from the Charlie's Tap when he was booking jazz, I did all that. John loved my drawings, so we would make t-shirts, Charlie's Tap t-shirts, and we just had a nice collaboration.
I also started the Central Square World's Fair.
He got, you know, the whole, all the businesses in Central Square to really come together, close the streets down. He had 9 stages, and he would bring me up, you know, from New York.
There would be all this great music, and he'd have these bands, you know, sometimes you look at it, people coming in from New Orleans and things like that. I mean, he had that vision.
100,000 people, 150,000 people used to come, because I'd have like a jazz stage with a sort of main act out in New York, you know.
Right.
And the Middle East would book some up-and-coming rock and roll band, like someone good, you know, and they'd draw people. And then we had the gospel people, and we had a Latin stage and an African stage and the children's stage and a dance stage. So
you closed off Central Square, essentially?
Yeah, we closed off Central Square. We'd have like, you know, 200 people selling stuff.
Yeah.
You know, everything from hot dogs to hats. What I did is I upped the ante for jazz in Boston.
Yeah.
And then, because when I first did it, the Regatta Bar and Sculler's were not open, but they opened shortly after that, and I forced them really to hire better people.
Right, because you were hiring better people.
I mean, these were cutting edge people, you know.
Right.
I mean, like, when Ken Burns did his jazz piece, the big documentary, at the end he said, a lot of people say, like, how come you didn't include this person, that person, that person? And he said, you know, we haven't had a cutoff date, right? But he said, I'm going to name 25 people that we could have done that are in the future. And like 20 of them had played at the Green Street Grill,
yeah.
You know.
But I always felt as a musician,
that I could play whatever the band I brought in there, but what we brought in there was going to be acceptable to John, and we could go for it.
Everyone told me to hire Abby Lincoln. She hasn't been in Boston, right? And so, maybe let's say April, because I knew she was famous. I booked her for October.
She was making a comeback, and she was going to perform at Green Street Grill night. We were all looking forward to it, and of course, it was that night. I think the Mets and the Red Sox were playing the final game of the World Series. No one came. She was in tears, and I remember that very well.
The food program just got better and better, so that by the whatever it was, after he had been there maybe 15 years or 10 or 15 years, it was one of the best restaurants in the city of Cambridge. It was very, very popular and very, very successful.
It was just nothing that I've ever done before. It was just, sort of like getting an opportunity and using it.
He was from Nevis in the West Indies, but he was trained as a French cook at Fiddler's East in St. Thomas. So when he came to the Green Street Grill, which I said before, I didn't really know anything about the food, or I didn't understand preparation for food for a restaurant. You know what I mean? I didn't understand about feeding 100 people.
Right.
I was more or less a cheeseburger. Give me a cheeseburger type of guy.
John didn't cook in the kitchen. One of the great things about working with him is that he gives free rein. He never dictate what you should or shouldn't do. You just had an opportunity to do what you think was right, and he loved it.
And what John did is took his knowledge from Nevis and stuff his mother used to take and cook, and took spices and berries and fruit and integrated it into his French cooking, which, French cooking has a sauce for everything.
Yes.
So he made an individual sauce for each dish. He got big time write-ups, back then.
Right. And so who followed him?
Mark Romano followed him.
I tried to make the transition, as smooth as possible, but Johnny's a great chef, and he's very unique, and so it wasn't like there was like a recipe book kicking around,
Yeah, right.
So as chefs, you kind of do your own take and your own spin on things. So that's kind of what I did, and John Clifford was, very supportive of that, and that's one of the great things about working for John was that, he believes in people. If he hires you, he believes in what you're doing.
So he was available when John left, and he came and he worked there for the last 6 years. I tell people this, and no one really believes me, but I never missed the place. Once,
really?
Green
Street Grill, once it was over.
I never missed it, for a minute.
When Ken, my partner, was elected the mayor of Cambridge, he became the first African American mayor in the state of Massachusetts, which is an awful thing to think could happen over all those years, and that there hadn't been one. And he was the first openly gay mayor in the United States, black mayor in the United States of America.
He wanted me to go to work for him for his education liaison. And, he was pissing and moaning to me on the 3rd that he wanted me to start then, And I had to wait till I sold the place, and I sold it. And I went to work for him the next day. Literally the next day. And the funny thing is, I had never used a computer before, really. And plus people were mad at him for hiring me because they didn't know I was educated.
I'd like to say people really didn't understand how smart he is. So the funniest part, when I named him my education liaison, the woman who had served the prior mayor said, "Oh my God," she says, "he doesn't know anything. That poor man, how will he be able to cope?" And I'm thinking, honey, you don't know who you got here. So they also said about me that, what does he know? Well, I think together, that's the perfect challenge that we had. And we show them, there will be no one who will work harder to improve public education in Cambridge during our tenure. And we will be doing it 24/7. And we won't be trying to maintain what you got. We're going to try to drag it to somewhere higher. And in that time, I had become aware of the work of Jeff Canada in the Harlem Children's Zone.
One of the things they do at the Harlem Children's Zone is they have a baby college, but what the baby college really is to teach parents how to be parents. In other words, you shouldn't yell at your kids, you shouldn't hit them, and you should feed them correctly, and you should talk to them. But, a lot of immigrant families who want their kids to learn English stuck them in front of the television rather than talking to them because they figured that's the way they'd learn English.
Yeah.
And so, believe me, we started that, and that was a fight because fucking city managers didn't want to spend the money. And Cambridge had the money too. They had $120 million in the black, right? And like this, they sent, they were afraid of Kent. They sent all these people to me, tell them, don't do this, he's going to ruin everything. But we set up a seminar and explained it, right? And brought all these people in, and they started it. We started this mentoring program too, where they follow kids through college. That was a fight too.
Most times in Cambridge, we just declare that we're the best, and then that's what we do. We're wonderful. Well, for lower income kids, we're not wonderful.
So I worked on that, and then housing issues, which were very difficult, because basically is a lot of people didn't do the paperwork correctly, or they move, or they lose it, and so they take them off the list, So I did a lot of that, and then try to find people jobs.
We used every minute to maximize the value for the citizens in Cambridge.
He followed through in a lot of these people's requests. Someone said, John, I'm trying to get into public housing. Maybe a conversation a month after that. How'd that guy do? Oh, we got him into, Section 8 housing in Everett. Or how'd that kid do that was having trouble, at English High? Oh, I call this guy, and Jerry Howland, he took care of it, and the kid's doing great.
I got this guy a job with another friend shoveling her snow. And he shoveled snow for the whole winter. And when the winter was over, her son said, well, I would like to have a receipt for this work. And somehow this reverend had this policy, he doesn't write nothing down, so he's not going to write nothing down. So we're at an impasse. And the son says, well, I can't extend any funds without a receipt. And I think we're talking $700-800. And I'm thinking, well, what is the solution to this? Well, the problem for me went away. I'm the mayor. I can't get into all of the details of how everything is resolved. Well, you know how it was resolved? John gave the guy the $800. His $800. And I'm thinking, John, I don't know if I would do that myself. But it was not, and he didn't come to me and say, well, Ken, it's really because of you I did this. He just got that solved. And it turns out when that guy died, he entrusted everything to John. This is what should happen. And
he really enjoyed that job. That was really a big part of him. That's who I see.
We were living at 50 Cherry Street. I grew up on 63 Cherry Street. Danny Quirk's paperboy was going to move, and he told us about this apartment, and we moved there on 50 Cherry Street, and that's where Frank was born and Vanessa was born. Not in the house, but we lived in that apartment, and they got christened here.
When did you buy this house?
1989.
1989.
Yeah. So this would have been like 6 years before rent control. And we were looking for a house, we were living in Somerville at the time, on Cherry Street. We were living on 50 Cherry Street, actually. And I kind of wanted to stay in Somerville. Pat did not want to stay in Somerville.
In August of 1989, we passed papers and started working on the house. We originally bought the first floor, the other couple bought the second floor, and we just started doing, it needed everything from, absolutely everything. It needed a total renovation, so we started working on it, and we were in that house at I think November 11th.
How old were the kids when you moved in here?
Well, Vanessa must have been 2. So that was 29 years ago. I think we've been here 29 years. I think next year would be 30.
The kids were baptized in St. Catherine's, and when Vanessa was baptized, Frank was, I think the story we told you was that Frank was there, and he was 2 at the time.
Frank was being disruptive because he wasn't getting enough attention. And his grandmother said to him, "Look at the candle, it's just like a birthday cake." And he started singing "Happy Birthday." And the priest got mad and told him to shut up, and he wouldn't. And he said, "Get that kid out of here." And I was holding Frank, and all the way out of the church, he sang "Happy Birthday." And it, the acoustics are very good inside there, so you could hear it all over the church.
John made us take 1,000 pictures all the time, every place we went. And we were like, why do we have to take so many pictures? He's like, you fucking kids don't understand. I never had pictures. I used to travel from house to house with shopping bags, and you fucking kids have the privilege that I'm taking you on this trip, and we're gonna stand there, we're gonna take a nice fucking picture for your mother.
So it was great. I know, I do think of that. So they had a stable upbringing.
When we sat at the dinner table, it was like, eat everything that's on your plate. You always have food, and I was starving, and I had to do X, Y, and Z to get food. But I know even like when we were teenagers, we'd be like, oh, I want this. He's like, cool. Well, I worked my whole entire life. Like, if you guys want something, you should work. So we worked at the bar. At 16, I was tending bar at the bar. I don't know if you were working at the bar.
It's the best way there when I was younger, but
yeah.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention his son is my godson, and his daughter is my daughter too. I once went to visit them I went to visit him at his school at his invitation. And maybe he's in the 3rd grade and maybe she's in the 1st grade. So I went to see his class and blah, blah, blah. So the next time I see her, she says, "Oh, Ken, I heard you were at my school." I said, "Yeah." She says, "I'm in room 301.
When John's way of raising Frank, I don't know, maybe he's 10 years old or something. The 2 of them would go down and grab mussels off the rocks, and we had delicious steamed mussels later in the day. But there was an elevated porch with grass underneath, and Frank would drive his mother a little crazy by going to the edge of the porch, and Pat would say, Get him away from that, John, he's gonna fall, get him away." And John's way to teach him was saying, no, fall. You want to jump? Jump. Frank, of course, jumps, and then he's crying at the bottom. And then, of course, he learned and he got better. So those are the two ways of raising a couple of marvelous children.
John was really good with the kids. Of course, he said he'd never treat, once we had Vanessa, he would never treat her any different. But that was, she's got him wrapped around her little finger. It's just the natural things that you do as parents. And we're, in the natural parenting stuff, the kids figured out early on what they could get away with me and what they could get away with him. And so, we were just the natural parent team.
A lot of parents said to me they wish they had spent more time with their kids when the kids were younger, you know what I mean? Because the kids get up and go, so, and because I had the bar, work nights, and I had a flexible schedule, I said, well, I'm going to do like a lot of stuff with them, So I did.
There is no question that John and Pat as a union have made him better and the world better in some ways, because they're a formidable team.
Well, I think my mom is everything, and I don't think my dad would be half of the man he is without her support.
It just every time you turn around, there's another story about how he helped somebody go to college, helped somebody live in their home, including my daughter who lived with Pat and John. And it's not just John and Pat's also extraordinary woman.
I do feel like he's a very communal father, because I literally will run into people in Brooklyn and they're like, oh, I know your dad. Somebody's like, oh, your dad helped my dad when he got out of jail, or get him an attorney, or immigration, or help my little brother, drove them around to college tours. So there's nothing that he did for Frank and I that he didn't do for countless other numbers of people.
He's a tremendous example, right, of passing the torch for all the future nieces and nephews.
Awesome.
The future grandchildren, he hopes. However, but it's a life that has been incredibly constructive.
About him, many people perceive him as gruff, and he had that. That's one of the personas, but they didn't know that just beneath that facade, there's many other great things. Sort of a warmth, an intelligence, a friendship that is never ending, actually, and quite rich in its breadth and depth.
Best friend. Best human being. He helped so many people in the city and elsewhere. He put so many kids in school who wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for him. And if you know him, you love him. And I love him.
Well, it's almost hard to believe how much John is John. What you see is what you get. He's a very authentic person, and he strives to be honest, and he's certainly up front with things, and he's got a good sense of humor. I mean, I think he does ultimately see the absurdity in it all.
I mean, he was always there for me, pushing me to do better. I played a ton of sports, I ran track, play football, play volleyball. He would always take me to games, trying to get me to go outside, you know, making sure we did outdoor activities, making sure I was being a fucking idiot that it's like, stop screwing up your life. But no matter what, you know, he was always there for me. And I think just the same way that he's always there for everybody else, you know. So he's always about a communal, very happy life. So that's something that can be spread sort of everywhere, you know. And I think the fact that he has all these friends and everybody knows him and everybody sort of, whether they were business or friends or family, has the same sort of opinion, you know. And he can be an asshole, but totally all these other qualities possibly outweigh that.
About John Clifford, he's a wonderful person. He's a wonderful person that has made a commitment, I think, in terms of his belief system, what he's about as a person, who has really worked his life to make the community that he's in and the country he's in and the world where he's in to be a better place for everybody. And he's worked diligently in that. He's worked for fair and equal treatment of all peoples. Pat is right there with him. His wife is right there with him. I'm sure they've had an influence on one another because they both have those qualities.
It's been a privilege to be the oldest brother, right? You have not blown it, and we thank you.
He doesn't, he walks forward really strongly with, and I don't mean that just physically, but in a spirit and a mind way. And he doesn't, you know, he's not a pitying himself kind of guy, and not a complaining kind of guy. With his own self, with his own spiritual being in terms of how he chose to be here. So I admire that a lot, and yeah, I'm really proud to call him my friend. Yeah, but Pat's a little better.